So welcome to this video series on JavaScript and game design. In this first lesson, we're going to have a super student-friendly introduction to the wonderful world of game design and JavaScript. And by lesson 2, you'll have your own game, fully fledged with a character, an enemy, and jumping capability. And by lesson 4, you would have recreated the famous game Flappy Birds in just 55 lines of code, hopefully understanding every single one of those lines. Now, if you've never done any programming or web design, I would suggest our web design series first, and that will introduce you to some basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Having said that, it's not necessary, it's recommended, but one of the best ways to learn is to actually pick a project or something really fun that you'd enjoy, like a game, and then learn as you go along. And that's what we're going to do in this series. So before we get started, let's look a little bit about the potential of game design in JavaScript. Now you can see here that game design has a projected market value which runs into the millions, if not the billions. And you can see 152.1 billion there was the estimated total for global video game sales in that year. And we're talking about 2017. Additionally, the job market is still exploding. There's a great need for JavaScript developers and indeed game design developers and engineers. JavaScript, interestingly, was created in 10 days by Brendan Eich, and look at where it is now. It is the front-end language of the World Wide Web. The future of the internet is also interesting to consider. You've probably heard of Tim Berners-Lee. He is the creator of the World Wide Web, and he is on a mission now to create a new, more secure, more private, more user-focused internet. And JavaScript is already playing a very pivotal role in that. Before we start coding, one of the most important things you'll need is what's called an IDE. That stands for Integrated Development Environment. Now, some of you might have been using Notepad, which you can. It's available freely on your machine, but I would highly recommend a proper and a professional IDE such as Brackets. Now, you can find Brackets here if you just Google it, download Brackets, and it gives you the option for a free download for PC. Obviously, if you're using a Mac or a Chromebook, you're going to have to look for the right instructions. Once you've downloaded it, you simply open it, follow the instructions to install it to your machine, and it makes it hugely easier to actually see what you're doing, to preview some of your games or the websites that you're making. And here I've just showed you the Brackets installation process. If you follow that, it should be pretty straightforward and simple. So Brackets has been successfully installed. There it is. Double click on it, you open it, this is what it looks like. It has an existing HTML page in there. You can say allow access to that. And as we go along, I'll show you how you can use Brackets. Remember, you don't have to use Brackets. You can use Notepad, you can use Sublime Text, you can use any IDE that you're familiar with, such as Dreamweaver, but I highly recommend Brackets. So let's get started with learning JavaScript. This is going to be project-based learning, but you are, as we go through this series, going to be learning the 3 programming constructs, which remember are sequence, selection, which are if statements, and loops, iteration. You're going to be using variables. A variable is something that stores a value, and it's going to be an event-driven game. In this lesson, you're going to end up with something that looks like this. So it's going to be an HTML page with a character, green character, and a red enemy, which is sort of falling on the green character. If you feel confident at this point with setting up HTML pages, a JavaScript page and a CSS page, you can pause the screen here and make a note and actually type out the HTML for the page. Again, pause the screen here, and this is the CSS for the page, which is going to allow for the styling of the character and of the enemy, as well as some of the animation. And the JavaScript in this lesson is going to be empty. So if you've done those 3 things, you will end up with the picture that I showed you on the screen before. You're going to have a stage, a main character, an enemy, the enemy moving towards the character has to jump. If he doesn't jump in time, he gets poked. So this is what we achieve, and you can pause the screen and do that. But however, what I'm going to do now is actually go through doing that with you from scratch, assuming you've never done this before, and explaining the concepts as we go along. So the first thing we're going to do is make a folder. So you right click somewhere where you want to make a folder. This could be in your OneDrive, or it could be in Replit, wherever it is you're making it, and you create a folder. In that folder, you're going to have 3 different files. Now remember, you could be doing this in brackets, which I'll show you in a minute, but for now, let me just make the first file here. So in this folder, I'm just going to make a file called index.html. Now, a lot of students do this, and they make the mistake of thinking that they've made an HTML file, but you can see over here, type is still text document. So what you need to make sure of is that you go File, Save As, and the name of the file is index.html. And you can see that now that really is an index.html. It's an edge, or that you could open it with Chrome or whatever. So that has not been created correctly. It's a text document, and we don't want a text document. So you can edit that again. So you can always go open with brackets or Notepad, and then that is your index.html file. So remember, index and .html file. Now once you've done that, you also need to make a style.css, which is where the CSS is going to go, and also a script.js, which is the JavaScript file. And let's do exactly the same thing, and I'm doing this the slow way just to make sure that you really understand what we're doing. So the script has to be a JavaScript file, and you can see it's still not. That one isn't, but this one is. So this is now a JavaScript file. So we can delete this one. And then you have a style, which needs to be a CSS file. You can see it's still a text document at the moment. So let us make that .css. And you can see that is now a CSS file. So let's delete the one that isn't. Now, usually if you do this in brackets, it's pretty simple. I am showing it to you in Notepad just in case some of you are coding in Notepad. A note is you can also code in Replit. Now Replit is an online IDE. I don't want to necessarily recommend it in case at some point it's no longer available, but if you do sign up to Replit, you can start coding. You can select HTML, CSS and JavaScript, and you can actually make an entire game in Replit. And you can preview it as well. So now we have our folder structure. You can see I'm going to call it something sensible, like My Amazing First Game, something like that. And inside it, I have 3 files. I'm now ready to start coding. I have suggested that you use brackets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use brackets to start doing this. However, you can just right-click on any of these files, and you can say Open with Notepad or whatever it is that you're using, a simple text editor, and you can just code using this. That's no problem. But you'll see the benefit of using a more sophisticated IDE like brackets. Just allows you better options for viewing, for previewing, auto-correcting, etc. So let's get started. So now that we have our folder, which is stored on my desktop, I'm going to open up brackets and close all if you have stuff open in it already, and I'm going to say open folder, navigate to my desktop, My Amazing Game. Don't actually go into it, so make sure you're just clicking on the folder and say select folder. And what it does is it brings up all the files on which are contained in the folder. You can say index.html, script.js, and style.css. So we're going to start coding. I'm going to start making my index page. Now something that is very handy is to download what's called a file extension called Emmet. And what you do is you click on Extension Manager down there, type in Emmet there, and just literally download it. I've already done it, And what that does is it allows you to have certain features which make coding in HTML super simple. For instance, you could just type in exclamation mark and tab. The tab is underneath the 1 on your keyboard, and you can see it gives me a ready-made HTML template, so I don't have to worry. However, if you don't have that, it's not a problem. Just type in your HTML template with a body, with a head, and with all the usual features, and that shouldn't be a problem, and it shouldn't take too long to set up. However, for now, I'm just going to set up it using this super cool quick template feature, and you can pause the screen and copy that if you don't have it. Now we're going to set up we can keep saving it like that, and we're going to set up our actual game. So I'm going to call it, let's call it the battle. Every game is in a sense a battle. You have an opponent, you have to get through obstacles, it's a bit like life. And in the body, this is creating a basic HTML page. I'm going to call it the battle. And just to show you that this does work, you can click on this lightning mark here, and you can see that this is the actual page that we're building. So it previews it. Now remember, if you're doing this in Notepad, all you have to do is double click and it does pretty much the same thing. It opens up the index page that you're making. So for now, we're going to be using brackets, like I said. I'm going to half the screen here so I can sort of code on the left and I can see the preview of what I'm actually producing on the right. So I've got the battle, and I'm going to add some interesting text. I'm going to say avoid the evil element thing, which is going to be red. So I'm going to say the red element is going to be the enemy. Let's turn that red. And you can see I've put the font color red around this red word. So if I save that, well, you can see automatically it's just gone red. So great, so I've got my sort of website set up. It's really simple and basic and nothing exciting there. But the important thing now is to create divs. A div is like a section, or a section of which will appear on your web page. We're going to have one massive big div, which is going to be the game itself. And remember, every div tag that you open should also be ended with a /div. So div ID equals game. We're giving it an ID called game so that we can refer to this ID later. And inside the game, inside this div for the game, I'm going to make two other IDs, or divs rather, which one is going to be called character. And you can see automatically it closes that div for me. So make sure you've done that. And I'm going to have another one. And in fact, just for simplicity, I'm just going to make that up there so you can see it. And let's just copy that and have another one, which is going to be the enemy. And so this is where my character and my enemy are going to be displayed on the screen. Now, we're going to be coding in the style.css page over here and in the script.js. So the index page needs links to these external files. You don't have to have links, so it is possible for you to simply, in the HTML file, put your JavaScript in script tags, or I could put in the head, for instance, in style tags, I could put in all my CSS. In that case, I wouldn't need these two files. But it is beneficial to have pages just so everything is organized. So now we're going to have to link to these two pages. For that, in the head, I'm going to have a little link which says link rel, rel, and you link it to a style sheet, in this case, which is the CSS. The hyperlink reference is style.css, which is simply the name of the file, which is that. You do exactly the same thing for the JavaScript file, but I'm going to put it just before the body, which helps with loading. So I'm going to call this script source, src, script.js, which is the name of the file, script.js, you can see. Close that, and also close the script tags, which it does for me in brackets. So great, so I have set up now my HTML page. Doesn't look like much is happening, but lots has happened in the background. So we're now ready to move on to actually make something appear on the screen, and that's going to be all down to the CSS. So we're now ready to make our style.css page and put something in it to add a character and an enemy. And before we do that, we need to understand some basic principles of game design. So I'm going to go through those with you in a minute. But to start with, let me just show you how some basic CSS looks. Now, we start with having a little star, which is referring to the game, and these curly braces. And you get the curly braces by clicking on the shift, and the curly brace tends to be near the P on a keyboard, on most keyboards, at least my keyboard. So you get these curly braces, and between these curly braces, you put in your CSS pertaining to whatever part of the game that you're doing. So for instance, for now, I'm just going to do some general stuff. I'm going to give the padding of the kind of like page or the context 0. You'll see how this looks in a minute. And remember that everything in a CSS file ends with a semicolon. So it doesn't look again like much has happened, but you'll see how this comes about in a minute. Now, remember the game div we had. I'm going to refer to it again. I'm going to say game with these curly braces, press enter between them, and I'm going to define the game. We can call it the canvas. PX stands for pixels, so 500, let's say. Let's give a height as well, something like 500. And let's give it a border of, say, 4 pixels, and let's make it solid. You can see immediately something has happened there. And I can choose a color. So I could have any color, and you could use a hexadecimal value for this. Now again, brackets is very useful because it gives you, if you right click and quick edit, you can choose colors from their little quick edit tool here. So I could choose pink or whatever you wanted. I'm just going to leave it as what it is there for now. Press the X. So I've got a border and I've got like a game context or a canvas in which I'm going to start coding. Now, we have 2 things, if you remember from your index. We have a character that we want to create, and we have an enemy. And we've created an ID, which means they sort of are there, but we haven't brought them into existence. And we're going to do that using CSS. So I'm going to refer to the character. Remember, we have this character here, so I'm referring to it using that ID. Again, use your curly braces, press enter in between them, and let's define what the character is going to be like. Now, let's say I want the character to be about 30 pixels. You can play around with this. As you're doing with me, I would suggest you just do exactly the same as with me for now, until you're more confident. And let's have a height of 120. You'll see how big that is in a minute. We can have a background color. Let's make it green. You can choose any of these nice greens. Don't forget the semicolon. Now, position is relative, which will something you might want to look up as well. So we can have absolute position or relative, so it can move around in the screen. And this is the bit that I'd really like to explain to you, which is one of the core principles of game design. Now you can see immediately, as soon as I typed in 380, that green rectangle, which is your character, it sort of moved down on the screen. Let's show you that again. So I type in 380, and this character is moving down. Why? I'm going to have a little border radius of 20. Check out what that does in a second. And I'm going to have an animation which we'll add later. So just for now, let's just leave that. So we've got that. Play around with these values, see what happens to them. So you have a border radius that's just giving me a bit of color. And I can do exactly the same thing with the enemy. So if I define the enemy with a width, making the enemy quite stout, a little bit bigger, 60 pixels perhaps, 60. Let's make him a square. Let's make him red for danger. You can see the enemy has appeared there. Now obviously I would like the position of the enemy to be relative to the screen, so that's fine. but I need to position the enemy, and I don't want him above the green character. I would like him perhaps on the right-hand side. So I'm going to type in top 320 and check out what happens. I'm going to explain what all this means in a minute. So if I type in left 440, where do you think the enemy is going to go? And strangely, you'll see that these coordinates and these numbers that I'm typing in will move the enemy. Now I've forgotten the pixel, so it's not working, and you can see that 440 moved it down. Now what do these numbers mean? What is this 380? If I change that to 0, you see that my character moves up to the top. If I move it down, say 500, it moves all the way down, in fact below the screen. So what do these numbers mean? Let's have a look at that, because this is one of the foundational principles of game design. At this point, we need to stop and think about a term called abstraction, which is a key pillar of computer science. When we code, we abstract. And what that means is we leave out the irrelevant details. So if we were making a game like Super Mario, for instance, we wouldn't be considering every speck of dust. We'd be focusing on what is important. Another thing to think is what I mentioned at the beginning, where we think of everything mathematically. So in one way or the other, we're converting everything we see, like a character or the enemy or the movement or collisions, into numbers or mathematical representations. Now, if you told a computer, move the character right, move it to the right, it wouldn't understand. You'd need to set out a framework with coordinates and actually feed it numbers or coordinates. Now consider this. Here Super Mario is on the left. Here he moves to the middle, and we have a canvas. Assume it's 500 by 500, which it isn't because it's a rectangle, but for now just pretend it is. And here you can see he's moved to the right. Now how do we put this mathematically? We can't say to a computer, move him left, move him right. We need to give it some sort of framework, like I said, give it numbers so that it understands everything. Now this is where you need to go back to primary school, or perhaps wherever you first learned about graphs. Now on the left-hand side where there's a cross, I'm not saying that's wrong, but these are the sort of graphs that you are used to seeing in mathematics. So you would have been familiar with a 0 in the middle here, and the y-axis, the positive coordinates going up, going down negative y over here. And similarly, the x-axis, you have 0 in the middle, with minus going to the left, positive to the right. Now that is not how it works in a computer coordinate system. Instead, you simply have 0. So just try and remember me saying this. You can come back to this slide and remind yourself, but you have 0 here in the sort of top left-hand corner. As you go down, that means y is increasing. The y-axis, the vertical axis, increasing as you go down, and as you go across, the x value is increasing. So this particular little pixel, this cell here, would be 3, 5. Now, again, coming back to this example, imagine that this was a 500 by 500. It's not a square, but just for the sake of this example, imagine this is a canvas of this size, and you have Super Mario here. And let's give it some variables now. Now, you could call this anything you like, but what we're going to call it in this game is top. And typically, when you're coding with CSS, these are the values you would use, so it's good practice. You have top, and this is referring to the top where the y-axis will be referred to, and you have left. So let me make that a bit more clear. So if you had here top, and I move Super Mario to the top, you can see that his top value, if I was to make this a variable called top, would be 0. Now, when I move him all the way down here, his top value is 500. In other words, I could call that the y value or whatever I wanted, but he's now at y value 500 or top 500. Now he's sort of in between, he might be 250. Top is equal to 250. And of course, Super Mario doesn't just move up and down, he also moves left and right. So we add in this extra variable called left. Now, at this point, we can see that he's at the top value for Super Mario is 500, he's down at the bottom, but the left value is also 500 or nearabouts. So if I moved Super Mario back over here, his left value is now 0, his left value is now maybe 250, etc. So you can now consider at any given point what his top value is. We can call it C-top and C-left. And as we go back now to our CSS, keep this in mind, and you might want to even replay it so you completely understand it. But keep in mind the computer coordinate system, not this one, that is going to really confuse you, but this one on the right. So we now come back to our CSS file and we have a look at it with new eyes, hopefully understanding a bit more what these top and these left little keywords mean. So if I was to change that top for the character, watch the character, you know that 0 would move it right up to the top of the y-axis, and you can play around. You can see that 400 slightly goes off, or the size of the canvas is 500 minus the top of it, and that we know the character is 30. So you can be a bit mathematical there, or you can just do it by trial and error, and I know that 380 gives me a nice fit there. And in the same way, we have top and left for the enemy. I don't want the enemy on top of the character. I want him, where he was. So for now, I'm just going to leave the enemy with those numbers. So 320, 440. And make sure you go back and you fully understand how the computer coordinate system works. So you can play around with that. Now what we want is we want the enemy to be moving. We don't want it to be static. The enemies that we have in life are not just there. They sort of come to us and then we have to battle problems. So how do we make our enemy move? There are different ways of doing it. You can do it using JavaScript. But for now, I'm going to use CSS, which is a very simple way of doing it, and it gives you some of the key principles, gets you to practice. So I'm going to have a little keyframes animation here called move enemy. You can call it anything you like. Same curly braces, and between the curly braces, I'm going to decide what my animation is going to look like. Now, to explain it simply, let's just pretend that you have different points of your animation. The starting point is 0%, right? And you define where you would like that to be. So for instance, maybe I would like the animation to start, at some point on the canvas. I'm going to say 380 px. And again, don't forget to have that semicolon. Now, I'm going to have a couple of different points in the animation. I'm going to have, let's just cut and paste it for simplicity. 0% is where it starts, maybe halfway through is kind of 50%, and then I'm going to have the end of the animation 100%. And I would want the top value to be at different places. So I'm going to make it kind of, drop down here at 58, and let's play around a bit to have maybe something slightly different. So I would like the left value here to be 0 pixels, so it's kind of landing near the character, which is not very good for the character. And then the top then to be 320. Let's play around with that and see what that looks like. Now, how do you add this animation to the enemy? Pretty simple. You just type in animation, move enemy, which is the name of that little animation there. And be very careful here. You're not typing in ls, you're not typing in is, you're typing in 1 second. 1 second, which is the amount of times you want it to, the refresh time there, and let's just type in infinite linear. And anything that you're unsure of, you can also look up, and hopefully I'm providing a basic explanation. You can see what's happening, that we have 3 points of the animation. It's slightly going off the screen, so you might want to adjust it slightly, but for now you can see the functionality. So we've got an enemy and he is jumping on our poor green character, and we want our character to be able to jump so he can get out of the way. So that's the next step. Let's do that. Let's make another. You might be able to pause the screen and maybe do this yourself based on what I've done for the enemy, but if not, just follow along, which is absolutely fine. So I'm going to make a jump keyframe this time, and we're going to have different top points. You can play around, trial and error again, to see what's the smoothest sort of way to make a character jump. While I was playing around, I realized that if you have it stay up at the top for a bit, it looks a bit more like a realistic jump. So I'm going to have in the middle over here at, say, 30% and say 50%. It's kind of hovering up at the top. It begins at 380, which is fine. It's coming down, and then it's 380 again at 100%. It goes back to its original position. So let's see what happens. But first, I need to add this jump animation to my character. You do it in the same way by saying animation. What's the name of the animation? Jump. Let's say 500 milliseconds on this time. Don't forget the semicolon. So now, when I click on the screen, or every 500 milliseconds, whatever, it jumps. And we've not completed this, so I will show you how this all comes together in a bit. So we've got some sort of movement here. Do pause the screen, make sure you've copied everything as is. Remember, it's best to just really copy the exact same numbers and the code that I'm writing the first time round, and as you make your own game, you can then experiment. So we've added some animation, and at this point it's useful to look back over your code and see if you can spot any mistakes. Now, even if you've been coding for years and years and years, it is likely that you will make mistakes. And one tiny mistake can stop everything from working. Now, for instance, I can see that I've used an equal sign there instead of a colon. And let's click the lightning to have a preview. I can also see that some of the things, like the border radius over here, isn't actually being applied to my enemy, for instance. If I can leave that as 10, but all I need to do is px. And then you can see a rounded border around the enemy, and I can do exactly the same thing with my character. You can see the character is now slightly rounded. So do check over your code, make sure there are no mistakes. That's one of the most important things you can do. At the moment, the character jumps on refresh, because that's what we've asked it to do. But what we would like it to do, which we're going to be doing in the next lesson, is maybe on key press, on the up arrow key press, it jumps up and it avoids this red character. And of course, if the red character, the enemy, touches the green character, the game ends. So far, that is basically what we have achieved. We've made a little website, effectively what is a website in HTML, and we've got some CSS generated characters from the enemy. We have some animation built in. So like I said, next lesson, we're going to add some JavaScript. We're going to add a game loop. We're going to make the character jump. We're going to make the character end. And just to end, I would suggest highly recommended two sites, jsfiddle.net and codepen.io. As you grow and go on this journey of being a developer, certainly game design, these two sites you will find invaluable. Lots of free stuff for you to experiment with, and you can even code your entire game on codepen.io. As you're going along with me in this game series and you're coding, you might find that you make mistakes, you get really frustrated, and actually just want to see my code, compare your code to mine, etc. Now, GitHub is where you're going to find the repositories of my code. So I'm just going to quickly show you how you can sign up just by signing up for a free account. You need an email address. Even without that, you click on the link. So I will, on Test and Track, provide you with various links. Suppose it's for this one. It just gives you, you'll come onto a page like a GitHub repository sort of page. These are the different repositories that I have. In my case, let me go on to this. You can see that I've got a couple of different ones. Battle 1, Battle 2, that's Lesson 1, that's Lesson 2, etc. So if you come onto a particular repository and go to this button here which says Code and simply download the zip. So once you've downloaded the zip, you can extract that folder and it will give you the code files. Another option actually is just to, once you get to this page, say Battle 1, which is for Lesson 1, or Battle 2, which is for Lesson 2, just click on the file and it gives you all the code. So you can compare, you can cut and paste. I do recommend that you actually type it out with me step by step, because that's the way you learn. But if you do get frustrated and you just want to have a quick fix, you can access all the code over here on GitHub.